Margaret Hayes pushed her cleaning cart down the long corridor of Fort Henderson Army Base, the wheels squeaking with each rotation. At 62 years old, her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her janitor's uniform hung loosely on her thin frame. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust particles that floated in the air around her. She had worked as a custodian at this Arizona military base for nearly 3 years now. Every morning, she arrived before dawn to clean the administrative buildings, the training facilities, and the hangar where the helicopters were maintained. The work was hard on her aging knees, but she never complained. Margaret needed this job, and she took pride in doing it well. As she mopped the floor outside the briefing room, a group of young pilots strutted past her. They were fresh-faced lieutenants, barely in their late 20s, their flight suits crisp and their attitudes even crisper. "Morning, Grandma," one of them called out with a smirk. His name tag read Harrison. "Make sure you get those floors extra shiny. Wouldn't want any of us real soldiers to slip." His buddies laughed, and Margaret simply nodded, moving her mop in steady strokes. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting with words. "Hey, I got a question for you," another pilot said, stopping in front of her cart. This one was Lieutenant Bradley, a tall man with perfectly styled blonde hair. "You think you could fly one of those Apache out there? I mean, if pushing a mop is too complicated, I can't imagine what you'd do with a multi-million-dollar attack helicopter." The group erupted in laughter. Margaret paused her mopping and looked up at them. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something that might have made these young men think twice if they had been paying attention. But they weren't. They saw only what they expected to see, an old woman in a janitor's uniform. "I imagine it takes a lot of training," Margaret said quietly, returning to her work. "Training?" Bradley scoffed. "Lady, it takes talent, skill, strength, things you probably wouldn't understand." As they walked away, still laughing and slapping each other on the back, Margaret continued cleaning. She had 2 more hours of work before her shift ended, and she had long ago perfected the art of blocking out cruel words. She had heard worse in her lifetime, much worse. Later that afternoon, as Margaret was emptying trash bins in the main hangar, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. Major Thompson, one of the senior officers, was speaking urgently into his phone near the Apache helicopters. "I don't care what it takes," he was saying, his voice tight with stress. "We need that pilot here by tomorrow. The training exercise with the foreign dignitaries cannot be postponed. The reputation of this entire base is on the line." He listened for a moment, then slammed his fist against the metal railing. "What do you mean he broke his leg? Find me someone else. Anyone who's qualified to fly the Apache and can demonstrate our capabilities to the visiting colonel from the Allied forces." Margaret pushed her cart a little farther away, not wanting to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help hearing the major's growing frustration. Apparently, the base's most skilled Apache pilot had been injured in a training accident, and they were scrambling to find a replacement for an important demonstration scheduled for the next day. That evening, as Margaret drove her old pickup truck home to her small house on the outskirts of town, she thought about the young pilots who had mocked her. She thought about the desperate major searching for a qualified helicopter pilot, and she thought about the life she had lived before she became a janitor at Fort Henderson. Her home was modest, a one-story house with peeling paint and a garden she tended on weekends. Inside, the furniture was worn but comfortable. Margaret made herself a simple dinner of soup and bread, then sat in her favorite chair by the window. On the wall across from her hung a shadow box, carefully dusted and maintained. Inside it were medals, ribbons, and insignia. A casual observer might not recognize them all, but anyone with military knowledge would immediately understand their significance. These were not the decorations of an ordinary soldier. Margaret's eyes moved to the photograph beside the shadow box. It showed a much younger woman in a flight suit, standing beside an Apache helicopter. The woman's dark hair was pulled back, her stance confident, her eyes fierce and determined. That woman had been Captain Margaret Hayes, one of the first female Apache helicopter pilots in the United States Army. She had served for 23 years, earning recognition and respect through countless missions and training exercises. She had flown in combat zones, saved lives, and mentored dozens of younger pilots. Her call sign had been Golden Eagle, earned during a particularly dangerous rescue mission where she had swooped in like a predator to extract wounded soldiers under heavy fire. But life had a way of changing things. Margaret's husband, David, had been diagnosed with cancer 12 years ago. She had taken early retirement to care for him, leaving behind the career she loved to be by his side during his final years. After David passed away, her pension and savings had seemed sufficient, but medical bills had a way of piling up, and unexpected expenses had drained her resources faster than she had anticipated. 3 years ago, facing financial hardship, Margaret had swallowed her pride and applied for the janitorial position at Fort Henderson. She had moved to Arizona for a fresh start, where nobody knew her history. She hadn't told anyone at the base about her past. What would be the point? Those days were behind her. She was just trying to make ends meet and live quietly. But tonight, as she sat in her chair looking at her old photograph, Margaret felt something stirring inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was the memory of who she used to be, the memory of what she could do. She thought about Major Thompson's desperate search for a pilot. She thought about the young lieutenants who had laughed at her, treating her like she was invisible, like she was nothing. Margaret stood up and walked to her bedroom closet. In the back, buried beneath old clothes and boxes, was a duffel bag she hadn't opened in years. She pulled it out and unzipped it slowly. Inside was her old flight suit, carefully folded. She lifted it out, and the familiar material felt both foreign and like coming home. For a long moment she stood there, holding the flight suit against her chest. Could she really do this? It had been over a decade since she had flown. Her reflexes weren't what they used to be. Her eyes were older, her body slower. But her mind was still sharp. And her skills, her training, that knowledge was still there, embedded in her bones and her muscle memory. Margaret made a decision that night. Tomorrow she would go to work as usual. She would push her cleaning cart and mop the floors. But she would also do something else, something that would remind her, and perhaps remind others, that people should never be judged by their current circumstances alone. The next morning, Margaret arrived at Fort Henderson even earlier than usual. She completed her cleaning duties with her typical efficiency, working her way through the administrative building. As she approached Major Thompson's office, she could hear him on the phone again, his voice strained and exhausted. "Sir, I understand the importance of this demonstration, but I simply don't have another pilot with the necessary qualifications. Lieutenant Morrison can fly, but he doesn't have enough experience with the Apache to perform at the level we need for international visitors." Margaret took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding in a way it hadn't in years, not from exertion, but from anticipation and a touch of fear. She knocked gently on the Major's open door. He looked up, irritated at the interruption. "Not now," he said curtly, waving her away. "Major Thompson," Margaret said quietly but firmly, "I believe I can help you with your problem." He blinked at her, confusion crossing his face. "What? Look, I appreciate your concern, but this is a military matter. I need to." "I can fly the Apache," Margaret said, her voice steady. "I'm a qualified pilot." The Major stared at her as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. "You? What? Ma'am, I don't have time for jokes right now." "It's not a joke, sir." Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. It was her old military ID, along with her flight certifications. She had brought them from home that morning, knowing she might need proof. Major Thompson took the documents with shaking hands. His eyes widened as he read them, then looked up at Margaret, then back down at the papers. His mouth opened and closed several times before he could form words. Captain Margaret Hayes, he read aloud. Golden Eagle. He looked at her with a mixture of shock and disbelief. You're the Golden Eagle, the pilot they still talk about in training, the one who completed the rescue in Kandahar under impossible conditions. Margaret nodded simply. That was a long time ago, sir, but yes, that was me. The major's office had fallen completely silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Major Thompson continued to stare at the documents in his hands, then at Margaret, as if trying to reconcile the elderly janitor in front of him with the legendary pilot whose exploits were still taught in flight school. Why are you working as a janitor? He finally managed to ask. Margaret's expression remained calm. Life circumstances change, Major. My husband was sick. Medical bills don't pay themselves. I needed work and this base had an opening. But you're a decorated pilot. You could have. Could have what, sir? I'm 62 years old. I've been out of active service for over a decade. No one's looking to hire someone like me to fly helicopters. She said this without bitterness, just stating facts. The janitorial position didn't require me to explain my past. It just required me to work hard, which I've always known how to do. Major Thompson set the documents down on his desk carefully, as if they were sacred texts. He leaned back in his chair, running his hand through his hair. Your certifications are outdated. You need to pass a flight physical and demonstrate current proficiency. I understand that, sir, but I also understand that you're desperate. The demonstration is this afternoon, and you don't have anyone else who can showcase the Apache's capabilities at the level your visitors expect. Margaret's voice was steady, confident. I may be old and I may be rusty, but I know that helicopter like I know my own heartbeat. Give me a chance to prove it. The major looked at her for a long moment, weighing his options. On one hand, putting a 62-year-old former pilot who hadn't flown in years into an Apache helicopter was potentially reckless. On the other hand, he had no other qualified options, and the international demonstration was critical for the base's standing and funding. The base medical officer is in, he said finally. And this is a big if, you can pass a flight physical this morning, I'll authorize a qualification flight. If you can demonstrate proficiency, you can fly this afternoon. But Captain Hayes, he emphasized her rank, if you can't, I need to know immediately so I can make alternative arrangements. Understood, Major. I won't let you down. 2 hours later, Margaret emerged from the medical office with clearance from the base doctor. He had been skeptical at first, but her blood pressure was good, her vision was correctable to standards with her glasses, and her reflexes were still sharp. She was fit to fly. Word had spread through the base like wildfire. The old janitor was actually a legendary pilot. People began to gather near the flight line, curious to see if it was really true. Lieutenant Bradley and his friends were among the crowd, their expressions ranging from disbelief to embarrassment. This has to be some kind of mistake, Bradley muttered. There's no way that cleaning lady can actually fly an Apache. I heard Major Thompson verified her credentials himself, another pilot said. They say she's the real deal, some kind of war hero. Harrison shook his head. Even if she could fly once, she's ancient now. This is going to be a disaster. Margaret emerged from the locker room wearing a flight suit that the base had hastily provided. It wasn't her old one, that wouldn't have been appropriate, but a current issue suit in her size. She walked with her head high, her shoulders back. The janitor's shuffle was gone. In its place was the confident stride of a combat pilot. She approached the Apache helicopter on the tarmac. A crew chief stood by, a young sergeant named Rodriguez. He had heard the stories too, but remained professional. Ma'am, he said, saluting, the bird is ready for you. Pre-flight has been completed, but I understand you'll want to do your own check. Thank you, Sergeant. Margaret returned the salute crisply. I will indeed. She walked around the helicopter slowly, her hands touching various points on the aircraft, checking panels, testing control surfaces, examining the weapon systems. Her movements were methodical, practiced, the routine coming back to her like a familiar song. The crowd watched in silence. Even the skeptical pilots had to admit that she moved like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret climbed into the cockpit, settling into the seat. Her hands moved across the controls, flipping switches, checking instruments. She placed the helmet on her head and adjusted the straps. For a moment, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It had been so long. Could she really do this? Then she opened her eyes and her hands moved with certainty. The Apache's engines began to whine, then roar to life. The rotors started turning, slowly at first, then faster, creating the distinctive whump-whump-whump sound that every military person recognized. Major Thompson stood with the tower operator, watching through binoculars. "Tower, this is Major Thompson. Clear Captain Hayes for takeoff and authorize training Area Delta for her qualification flight." "Roger that, sir. Captain Hayes, you are cleared for takeoff." Margaret's voice came through the radio, and even through the static her confidence was clear. "Tower, this is Golden Eagle, lifting off now." The Apache rose smoothly from the tarmac. There was no hesitation, no wobble. It climbed steadily, then banked gracefully to the left, heading toward the training area. The crowd watched as the helicopter grew smaller, then disappeared over the desert hills. In the training area, Margaret put the Apache through its paces. She started with basic maneuvers, hovers, forward flight, turns, altitude changes. Everything felt right. The controls responded to her touch like an extension of her own body. The years fell away and she was Captain Hayes again, master of her craft. Then she moved to more advanced maneuvers. Sharp banks, rapid descents, nap of the earth flying where she skimmed just above the desert floor. She practiced target acquisition, locking onto simulated targets with the Apache's sophisticated weapon systems. The helicopter danced through the sky, powerful yet graceful, deadly yet controlled. Margaret felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. This was who she was meant to be. This was home. Back at the base, Major Thompson listened to the reports from the tracking station. "Sir, her performance is exceptional. All maneuvers executed perfectly. Response times are excellent. She's flying that Apache like it's a part of her." The Major allowed himself a small smile. "I never doubted the Golden Eagle." After 45 minutes, Margaret brought the Apache back to base. The landing was textbook perfect, smooth, controlled, precisely on the marked spot. As the rotors wound down, the crowd that had gathered was completely silent. Margaret climbed out of the cockpit and removed her helmet. Her gray hair was slightly mussed, and there was a light sheen of sweat on her face. But she was smiling, truly smiling for the first time in years. Major Thompson approached her quickly. "Captain Hayes, that was outstanding. You're cleared to fly the demonstration this afternoon." "Thank you, Major. It felt good to be back in the air." As she walked past the group of young pilots, their earlier mockery was nowhere to be seen. Lieutenant Bradley stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. "Ma'am, we owe you an apology, the things we said." Margaret stopped and looked at him. Her expression wasn't angry, but it was firm. "Lieutenant, you made assumptions based on what you saw on the surface. You saw an old woman pushing a cleaning cart and you decided that was all there was to see. That was your mistake, and it's a lesson you should remember. In combat in life, things are rarely what they first appear to be. The enemy you underestimate is the one who defeats you." Bradley nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "Good. Now I suggest you all attend this afternoon's demonstration. You might learn something." The afternoon arrived with clear skies and perfect flying weather. The visiting dignitary was Colonel Viktor Petrov from an allied nation's Air Force. He had come to evaluate the capabilities of the American Apache program, and to observe training procedures. His report would influence his country's decision about whether to purchase Apache helicopters for their own military. The base commander, Colonel James Morrison, greeted the visitor personally. "Colonel Petrov, welcome to Fort Henderson. We have an excellent demonstration planned for you this afternoon. Our pilot is one of the finest to ever fly the Apache." "I am very interested to see this," Petrov replied in accented English. "We have heard much about the Apache's capabilities. We wish to see them in action." They moved to the viewing area, where rows of seats had been set up for officers and visiting personnel. The young pilot sat in the back, still processing the morning's revelations. Major Thompson stood with the senior officers, quietly confident. Margaret performed her pre-flight check once more, being thorough even though she had just flown that morning. Sergeant Rodriguez assisted her, and she could sense his respect in the way he worked. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying," Rodriguez said quietly, "my father flew with you in Afghanistan. He was one of the soldiers you pulled out during the Kandahar rescue. He's talked about you my whole life. When I heard you were here, I could barely believe it. He's going to lose his mind when I tell him I crewed for the Golden Eagle." Margaret paused, touched by his words. "What's your father's name, Sergeant?" "Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, ma'am, retired now." "I remember Miguel. He was a good soldier. You tell him Captain Hayes says hello and that I'm proud of the son he raised." Rodriguez's eyes glistened. "Yes, ma'am, I will." Margaret climbed into the cockpit once more. This time there was no nervousness, no doubt. She was ready. As the engines powered up and the rotors began to turn, she felt completely at peace. The demonstration began with standard flight patterns, showcasing the Apache's speed and maneuverability. Margaret flew with precision, each movement calculated and smooth. Then she moved into more aggressive maneuvers, combat approaches, evasive actions, rapid target acquisition sequences. The crowd watched in awe as the Apache seemed to defy physics, moving in ways that didn't seem possible for such a large, heavily armed aircraft. Margaret was showing them what the helicopter could do in the hands of a true master. Colonel Petrov leaned forward in his seat, completely focused. "This is remarkable," he said to Colonel Morrison. "The pilot has extraordinary skill." "Captain Hayes is one of our finest," Morrison replied, even though he had only learned of her existence that morning. For the finale of her demonstration, Margaret performed a maneuver that few pilots ever attempted, a combat simulation that involved multiple target acquisitions while performing evasive actions in a narrow canyon. The training area included a section of desert terrain with deep arroyos and rock formations that simulated hostile territory. Margaret dropped the Apache low, skimming mere feet above the desert floor. She weaved between rock formations, the helicopter responding instantly to her commands. On the targeting screen, simulated enemy positions lit up. One by one, she locked onto them, demonstrating how the Apache could engage multiple threats while maintaining defensive posture. The crowd held their breath as she flew into the narrow canyon, banking sharply to follow its curves. The rotor wash kicked up dust devils on the canyon floor. She popped up over a ridge, acquired two more targets, then dove back down, using the terrain as cover. In the viewing area, Lieutenant Bradley whispered to Harrison, "I've been flying for 6 years, and I couldn't do half of what she's doing right now." "None of us could," Harrison admitted quietly. "She's operating on a completely different level." Margaret brought the Apache back around for the final approach, executing a perfect tactical landing in the designated zone. As the engines powered down, the crowd erupted in applause. Even the most hardened senior officers were clapping enthusiastically. Colonel Petrov stood up, still applauding. "Extraordinary," he said to Colonel Morrison. "In all my years I have rarely seen such mastery. This pilot, I must meet him personally." Colonel Morrison corrected with a slight smile. "Captain Margaret Hayes. And yes, I believe she would be happy to meet with you." Petrov's eyebrows rose in surprise, but his expression showed only respect. "A woman pilot, even more impressive. In my country, we are only beginning to train female pilots for combat roles. This is excellent proof of their capabilities." Margaret emerged from the Apache, removing her helmet once more. She was tired. The intensive flight had taken more out of her than it would have a decade ago, but she stood tall. Major Thompson approached with Colonel Morrison and Colonel Petrov. "Captain Hayes," Colonel Morrison said formally, "may I present Colonel Victor Petrov of the Allied Air Forces. Colonel Petrov, this is Captain Margaret Hayes, call sign Golden Eagle." Petrov extended his hand and Margaret shook it firmly. "Captain Hayes, that was the finest helicopter demonstration I have witnessed in my career. You have not only shown the Apache's capabilities but proven the value of experience and skill. I am honored to meet you." "Thank you, Colonel. The Apache is an exceptional aircraft. It's been an honor to fly her again." "If I may ask," Petrov said, "how long have you been flying?" "I have over 20 years of flight experience, sir, though I've been retired from active duty for 12 years. Petrov looked at Colonel Morrison with approval. "You bring back retired pilots for special demonstrations. This shows wisdom. Experience cannot be replaced by youth alone." Morrison, to his credit, handled the awkward moment smoothly. "Captain Hayes is an invaluable resource for this base, Colonel. We're fortunate to have her expertise available." As the formal reception continued, Margaret found herself surrounded by officers wanting to shake her hand and hear her stories. The young pilots who had mocked her that morning now looked at her with something approaching awe. But as the afternoon wore on, Margaret felt the weight of her years settling back onto her shoulders. The adrenaline was fatting, and the physical demands of the flight were catching up with her. She quietly excused herself and made her way back to the locker room to change. As she was leaving the building in her janitor's uniform once more, her flight suit returned to the base, she encountered Lieutenant Bradley waiting outside. "Ma'am," he said, standing at attention, "I wanted to apologize again, not just for what I said but for my whole attitude. I thought I was hot stuff because I could fly, but watching you today, I realized I don't know half of what I thought I knew." Margaret studied him for a moment. The cocky arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine humility. "Lieutenant, flying skill is important, but it's not everything. What matters more is your character. How you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you, that's who you really are. Remember that." "I will, ma'am, I promise." She nodded and continued walking to her truck. As she drove home that evening, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride, certainly. She had proven she still had what it took. Satisfaction in putting those young pilots in their place, perhaps, but also a deep sadness. Flying that Apache had reminded her of everything she had lost, not just her career but her identity. For those hours in the air, she had been Captain Hayes again, the Golden Eagle, doing what she was born to do. Now she was going back to her small house, back to her cleaning cart and mop, back to being invisible. That night she sat in her chair again, looking at her medals and photograph. She had proven something today, but to what end? Tomorrow she would wake up and return to work as a janitor. The bills would still need to be paid. Life would go on as it had been. But the next morning brought a surprise. When Margaret arrived at the base, Major Thompson was waiting for her in the parking lot. "Captain Hayes," he said, "Colonel Morrison would like to see you in his office, right away." Margaret's heart sank. Had she done something wrong, violated some protocol by flying yesterday? She followed the major to the commander's office, her mind racing through possibilities. Colonel Morrison stood when she entered, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit down, Captain Hayes. Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you, sir." Morrison sat behind his desk, his expression serious but not unkind. "Captain Hayes, I want to start by thanking you for your service yesterday. You saved this base from a very embarrassing situation, and you gave a demonstration that exceeded all expectations. Colonel Petrov was so impressed that he's recommending his country purchase an entire fleet of Apache. And he specifically cited your demonstration as the deciding factor. I'm glad I could help, sir. That said, Morrison continued, your situation has put me in a difficult position. I have a decorated combat veteran, a legendary pilot, working as a janitor on my base. That doesn't sit right with me. Margaret felt a flash of defensiveness. Sir, I needed the work. There's no shame in honest labor. No, there isn't, Morrison agreed. But there is waste in having someone with your skills and experience pushing a cleaning cart when you could be doing so much more. I've spent the evening reviewing your file and making some calls. Captain Hayes, how would you feel about coming back to active duty? Margaret stared at him, not sure she had heard correctly. Sir, I'm 62 years old. The military doesn't. The military can make exceptions for exceptional circumstances, Morrison interrupted. We need experienced pilots to train the next generation. We need people who can teach not just the mechanics of flying, but the wisdom that comes from real combat experience. Your age isn't a liability, it's an asset. You would serve as a flight instructor and consultant, working with our pilot program. But I haven't flown regularly in 12 years. You flew yesterday like you'd never stopped, and this wouldn't be about you flying regular missions, though you'd be qualified and authorized to fly as needed. This would be about you teaching others to fly the way you do, passing on your knowledge before it's lost. Margaret felt tears threatening to form. She blinked them back. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say yes, Morrison said simply. The pay would be commensurate with your rank and experience, much better than what you're making now. You'd have full military benefits again, and you'd be doing what you were meant to do. Margaret thought about her small house, her cleaning cart, the years of invisible labor. She thought about the feeling of being in the Apache's cockpit again, of doing something that mattered, of being seen and valued for who she truly was. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I would be honored to accept. Morrison smiled and stood, extending his hand. Welcome back to active duty, Captain Hayes. You report to the Flight Training Division Monday morning. We'll get your paperwork processed immediately. As Margaret left the office, she felt as if she were floating. Major Thompson was waiting outside, grinning. Congratulations, Captain. I put in a recommendation for your reinstatement last night. The Colonel made it happen faster than I expected. Thank you, Major, for everything, for giving me a chance yesterday. You earned that chance, and now you're going to help us make better pilots. These kids need someone like you to show them what real excellence looks like. The news spread through the base quickly. By lunchtime, everyone knew that the janitor who had turned out to be a legendary pilot was coming back to active duty as an instructor. Margaret's first day as a flight instructor began on a Monday morning 3 weeks later. The interim had been a whirlwind of paperwork, medical recertifications, and refresher training. She had moved out of her small rental house and into base housing, a simple but comfortable apartment that felt more like home than anywhere she had lived in years. She stood in front of her new class, 8 young pilots, including Lieutenants Bradley and Harrison. They looked at her with a mix of respect and nervousness. The story of the janitor who had humbled them all had become legendary on base. Good morning, Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of experience. I'm Captain Hayes, and I'll be your primary instructor for advanced Apache operations. Some of you already know me. Some of you learned a valuable lesson from me a few weeks ago. Either way, we're starting fresh today. She walked slowly in front of the class, making eye contact with each pilot. Flying an Apache isn't just about technical skill. It's not about how many buttons you can push or how fast you can complete a pre-flight check. It's about understanding the machine, yes, but more importantly, it's about understanding yourself. It's about knowing your limits, respecting your equipment, and never underestimating anyone or anything. Bradley raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we develop that kind of understanding? The kind of instinct you showed in your demonstration?" "Good question, Lieutenant. The answer is time, practice, and humility. You have to fly enough to make the helicopter an extension of yourself. You have to practice enough to make the right response automatic. And you have to stay humble enough to keep learning, even when you think you know everything." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation. "We're going to start with something basic, emergency procedures, because I don't care how skilled you are. Eventually, something will go wrong. The question is whether you'll be prepared to handle it." Over the following weeks, Margaret transformed the flight training program. She didn't just teach procedures, she taught wisdom. She shared stories from her combat experience, not to brag, but to illustrate principles. She was demanding but fair, pushing her students to excel while supporting them when they struggled. One afternoon, she took Harrison up for a training flight. He was a skilled pilot, but he had a tendency to showboat, to take unnecessary risks to look impressive. "Lieutenant," she said over the intercom as he executed an overly aggressive turn, "what are you trying to prove right now?" "I'm demonstrating advanced maneuvering capability, ma'am." "No, you're showing off. There's a difference. In combat, flashy flying gets you killed. Smooth, efficient, controlled flying keeps you alive and accomplishes the mission. Try that turn again, but this time make it 30% less aggressive. I guarantee you'll complete it faster and with better target acquisition capability." Harrison followed her instruction, and she was right. The more controlled approach was actually more effective. "See that?" Margaret said. "Flashy isn't better. Better is better. Remember that." As the months passed, Margaret's reputation grew. Other bases started requesting her as a consultant for their training programs. She traveled occasionally to share her expertise, always returning to Fort Henderson, which had become her home again. But her impact extended beyond just flight training. Her story had resonated with people across the military and beyond. A journalist from a military magazine interviewed her, and the resulting article, "The Janitor Who Was a Legend," went viral. It was picked up by mainstream media, and suddenly Margaret was receiving interview requests from major news networks. Colonel Morrison called her into his office. "Captain Hayes, you've gotten some attention. CBS wants to interview you for a feature segment. Are you comfortable with that?" Margaret considered it. "Will it help with recruitment, sir? Will it show young women that they can have a place in military aviation?" "I believe it will." "Then yes, I'll do it." The CBS interview aired on a Sunday evening in early spring. Margaret sat in her flight suit, the Apache visible in the background, and told her story simply and honestly. She talked about her career, her retirement to care for her husband, her financial struggles, and her time as a janitor. She talked about the young pilots who had mocked her and how that had motivated her to prove herself. "I don't blame those young men," she said to the interviewer. "They saw what they expected to see. We all do that sometimes. The lesson isn't about me being special. The lesson is that everyone has a story, everyone has value, and we should treat people with respect regardless of their current circumstances." The interviewer asked, "What do you want people to take away from your story?" Margaret thought for a moment. "I want people to know that it's never too late to reclaim who you are. I spent 3 years invisible and I accepted that because I thought that's just how life was. But when I got back in that cockpit, I remembered something important. Your circumstances don't define you. Your character does. Your skills do. Your determination does. I'm 63 years old and I'm just getting started again." The interview ended with footage of Margaret flying the Apache, the helicopter moving through the sky with grace and power under her command. The response was overwhelming. Margaret received thousands of letters and emails from people who had been inspired by her story. Many were veterans who had struggled to find their place after service. Many were older people who felt invisible in society. Many were women who saw in Margaret proof that they could succeed in fields traditionally dominated by men. One letter came from a woman named Sarah who had been working as a cashier after retiring from the Navy. "Your story gave me the courage to apply for a position teaching maritime navigation at the community college," Sarah wrote. "I got the job. Thank you for reminding me that my experience has value." Another came from a 16-year-old girl named, "I want to be a pilot like you," she wrote. "My guidance counselor said I should consider something more realistic. I showed her your interview. I'm applying to the Air Force Academy. Thank you for showing me what's possible." 6 months after returning to active duty, received an unexpected visitor. Colonel returned to Fort Henderson, this time with a delegation of pilots from his country who were there for Apache training. "Captain Hayes," he said warmly, shaking her hand, "I have brought my finest pilots to learn from the best. We purchased the Apache because of your demonstration. Now we would be honored if you would help train our people to fly them." "It would be my pleasure, Colonel." Over the next 2 weeks, worked with the international pilots. Despite language barriers, the universal language of flight transcended words. She showed them techniques, shared her experience, and earned their deep respect. On the final day of their training, Colonel presented with a medal from his country, an honor rarely given to foreign military personnel. "This is for exceptional service to international military cooperation," he said formally. "But personally, Captain Hayes, this is for showing us that excellence has no age, no gender, no limitations except those we place on ourselves." That evening, Fort Henderson held a ceremony in honor. The base theater was filled with pilots, officers, enlisted personnel, and even some civilians from the local community. Sat on the stage, uncomfortable with the attention but gracious in accepting it. Colonel spoke first. "7 months ago, Captain Hayes was invisible on this base. She cleaned our floors and emptied our trash, and we walked right past her without seeing who she really was. Today, she has transformed our flight training program, inspired thousands of people around the world, and reminded us all of an important truth. Every person has value, every person has a story, and we ignore that at our own peril." He turned to Captain Hayes. "On behalf of this base and the United States Army, I want to thank you not just for your service in the past, but for your service now. You have made us all better." Then he did something unexpected. He called Lieutenant Bradley to the stage. The young pilot looked nervous as he approached. "Lieutenant Bradley," said, "you wanted to say something." Bradley stood at attention, then turned to face. "Ma'am, 7 months ago I was one of the pilots who mocked you. I called you Grandma and suggested you couldn't handle a mop, let alone an Apache. I judged you based on your age and your uniform, and I was completely wrong." His voice was steady, but there was genuine emotion behind it. "Since then, you've been my instructor, and you've taught me more than just how to fly. You've taught me about respect, about humility, and about real strength. The example you've set, not just as a pilot but as a person, has changed the way I approach everything. I wanted to publicly apologize for my behavior and to thank you for not giving up on me despite how I treated you." Stood and shook his hand. "Apology accepted, Lieutenant, and thank you for the growth you've shown. That takes courage too." The ceremony concluded with a standing ovation. As looked out at the crowd, she saw Sergeant with tears in his eyes, young pilots who now looked at her with admiration, and fellow officers who had come to respect not just her skills but her character. After the ceremony, as people filed out, Major approached. "How does it feel, Captain, to go from invisible to celebrated?" Smiled. "Honestly, Major, I don't need the celebration. What matters to me is that I'm doing meaningful work again, that I'm using my skills to help others, that I wake up every morning with purpose. Everything else is just noise." "That's what makes you special," said. "You never needed external validation. You always knew your worth." "No," corrected gently. "I forgot my worth for a while, that's the truth. I let circumstances convince me that I was just a janitor, just an old woman, just someone to be overlooked. Getting back in that cockpit reminded me of who I am. But the real lesson was learning that I should have remembered that all along, even when I was pushing a cleaning cart. My value didn't change based on my job title. I just forgot to see it myself. A year after returning to active duty, stood in the same hangar where she had once mopped floors. This time, she was there for a graduation ceremony. Her first class of advanced students was completing their training. She watched with pride as they received their certifications. Bradley was among them, transformed from an arrogant young pilot into a confident, skilled, and humble officer. Harrison had learned to balance his natural ability with discipline. All of them were better pilots because of her teaching. As the ceremony ended, walked out to the flight line where an Apache sat waiting. She had a flight scheduled, a routine training mission, nothing special. She climbed into the cockpit, settled into the seat, and placed her hands on the controls. For a moment, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The years of service, the sacrifice of leaving to care for David, the humbling experience of financial struggle, the invisibility of being a janitor, and finally, the reclamation of her identity and purpose. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns. Sometimes you fell. Sometimes you were forgotten. Sometimes people judged you unfairly or treated you as less than you were. But had learned that none of that mattered as much as how you responded. She had chosen to prove herself not out of anger or revenge, but out of a quiet determination to remember who she was. And in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her own life but had inspired countless others to do the same. The Apache's engines powered up and lifted off smoothly. As she climbed into the clear Arizona sky, she smiled. She was Captain Hayes, call sign Golden Eagle, and she was exactly where she belonged. Below her, a new janitor, a young veteran named who had struggled to find work after his service, pushed a cleaning cart across the tarmac. He had heard story. It had given him hope. He was studying at night, working toward becoming an aircraft mechanic. Couldn't see him from the air, but if she could have, she would have recognized the determination in his stride. She would have known that he, too, was more than he appeared to be. She would have understood that everyone has a story, everyone has potential, and everyone deserves to be seen. As the Apache soared through the sky, thought about all the people who had written to her, all the lives her story had touched. She hadn't set out to be an inspiration. She had simply refused to accept invisibility as her permanent condition. And in the end, that was the most powerful lesson of all. You are never just anything. You are always the sum of your experiences, your skills, your character, and your choices. Age doesn't diminish that. Circumstances don't erase it. As long as you remember who you are, you can reclaim your purpose at any moment. The Golden Eagle flew on, guardian of the sky, teacher of wisdom, proof that legends never truly fade. They just wait for the right moment to rise again.